So metformin's got a long history in cardiovascular risk reduction, really dating from the UK prospective diabetes study, which was published in 1998, and it did show, a reduction in fatal and non-fatal myocardial infarction, fatal and non-fatal stroke, but it wasn't reported in the way that we would now consider to be the gold standard for cardiovascular outcome trial, and it was relatively small, with only 300 or 400 per group and somewhat adaptive design. But overall, there's moving on from UK PDS, which did show a reduction in myocardial infarction, particularly, and probably a reduction in MACE. There are other more recent trials that also, provide some backup for metformin being associated with cardiovascular risk reduction, and a meta-analysis in 2017 that showed a strong trend in the right direction, but not absolute statistical significance. So yeah, removal was a trial that I led, which was a trial of metformin in type 1 diabetes in over 400 people with type 1 diabetes. They were adults around the world, so it was an international trial. And it was a 3-year follow-up, and the primary outcome, because it was a smaller trial, was carotid intima media thickness progression, which is a surrogate, obviously. And it was a complicated message because we had two different ways of measuring the carotid IMT. One was a primary outcome, one was a tertiary outcome. And the tertiary outcome did show a significant reduction, the primary only a trend. And remembering that the people in the trial had had type 1 diabetes for more than 30 years and were loaded for cardiovascular risk factors, and 13% already had an event, it perhaps was surprising that we were able to show an impact of metformin on a measure of atherosclerosis. So it's another piece of evidence that provides some support for the idea that metformin can attenuate atherosclerosis progression. I showed at a symposium last night that's available online as well for Merck that we've done a subgroup analysis recently in the non-smokers of removal, so the non-current smokers. So that's about 87% of the original trial population, and in that 87% of non-smokers, the primary outcome of removal was actually positive. So we did reduce both measures of carotid IMT, what we call the mean and the maximal carotid IMT. So I think perhaps smoking could interact with the effect of metformin in a negative way, so that it's not so effective if you're a smoker. And obviously people at risk of cardiovascular disease should try and stop smoking. This is an idea that has been around for a few years, and it's the idea of, because you can't do a cardiovascular outcome trial in type 2 diabetes with metformin because really almost everyone is on it already, so you'd have to take people off it for the trial. So the idea is to go to a population of people with pre-diabetes, which there's already quite a lot of evidence of metformin metabolically, but to do a fully powered cardiovascular outcome trial with metformin, so people with diabetes and established cardiovascular disease. So we'd actually tried to get that funded in the UK and done a feasibility study, but the VA in the States have now funded a study called VA Impact. 8,000 people with type 2 cardiovascular disease will be followed up, and I think the trial will be reported in 2024. Yeah. The new EASD guideline takes a different approach than previous diabetes guidelines because it suggests that people who have very high cardiovascular risk or high cardiovascular risk perhaps should kind of skip metformin and go to the SGLT2 inhibitors or the GLP-1 agonists directly first line without necessarily going on metformin, although it can be considered. So it's a change in emphasis, and the reason for that, I think, is been given that the UK PDS was done in people with recently diagnosed type 2 diabetes who didn't have a strong background of cardiovascular disease. So the home trial is just an interesting trial that I think should be mentioned in this context. and isn't cited in the guideline, which was, again, a smallish trial in very high-risk people with type 2 diabetes, which was reported a number of years ago, people with existing cardiovascular disease, randomized to metformin or placebo, and as a secondary outcome, macrovascular disease, defined in quite a wide way, to be fair, was reduced by metformin. So, again, suggestive, perhaps not conclusive evidence that metformin reduces atherosclerosis, but I think a very worthwhile study that perhaps doesn't get the attention it deserves.